The Rachel Maddow Show, weeknights at 9 Eastern on MSNBC.
Happy to have you with us tonight. It has been a week of many legal filings and all sorts of cases involving Donald Trump and associates of Donald Trump. If you're like me, you are looking forward to curling up this weekend with a big stack of courtroom transcripts you haven't yet had time to digest. But here's one thing we learned this week from a filing by prosecutors in the case against former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort. We learned this week from prosecutors what they were looking for when FBI agents raided Paul Manafort's house last summer. We learned the whole list of specific stuff they were looking for. That included, quote, communications, records, documents, and other files involving any of the attendees of the June 9th, 2016 meeting at Trump Tower. That Trump Tower meeting was where Paul Manafort, Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner met with a whole bunch of Russians, ostensibly to receive delivery of Russian government dirt on Hillary Clinton, which the Russians said they were providing to the Trump campaign to help them win the election. Now, that meeting, of course, has remained a real point of focus in the Russia investigation. But it's also still kind of a black box. I mean, after concealing for almost a year that meeting had ever happened in the first place, once it came out, everybody involved in that meeting has said, yeah, nothing to see here. It was no big deal. It was all one big nothing. We kept it secret, sure, but not for any reason. Nothing happened. Well, tonight, NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel has a scoop about one of the participants in that meeting. It is a scoop that may get us a step closer to understanding why that whole thing happened and why that exact cast of characters turned up that day for that meeting. Tonight we are going to Tallinn, Estonia, where our own Richard Engel is live on assignment.
Good evening tonight from Tallinn. We're here in this tiny Baltic city near the Russian border to cover large-scale war games that NATO has been holding. It's practice on how to defend against a massive cyber attack launched by a fictitious country that seems a lot like Russia. So NATO is preparing, but today Republican members of the House Intelligence Committee gave President Trump a pass when it comes to Russia. They said they found no evidence of collusion between Trump's 2016 presidential campaign and the Kremlin. Which brings us to that scoop Rachel was talking about. Our investigation has uncovered new information that suggests the Russian lawyer at the Trump Tower meeting, the meeting where Trump campaign officials thought they'd be getting dirt on Hillary Clinton, was far more connected to the Russian government than she'd acknowledged before. In fact, in our interview, she called herself an informant for a Russian government agency. She had previously told a Senate committee that she operates independently of any governmental bodies.
For almost a year, Natalia Veselnitskaya has been sticking to the story, confidently declaring that she has nothing to hide. Eloquent, charming, and guarded, she was happy to give us an interview, but asked her staff to record it.
Ну, на самом деле, мы всегда пишем все интервью, которые я даю. Это моя степень безопасности. Just a second. I'm finished, please. Okay, давайте, чтобы
We agreed to the recording and asked her the key question: what was she doing at Trump Tower?
What objective were you pursuing, and on whose behalf were you pursuing that objective?
От собственного имени, как человеку, которому не все равно эта история.
Are you saying you were acting as a concerned citizen?
В данном случае я выступаю, наверное, да.
The issues she was concerned about were American sanctions, which she says are based on lies and false reporting. She wanted them lifted. Donald Trump Jr. described the meeting as a waste of time. That's not what it looked like to a seasoned intelligence professional.
In intelligence parlance, we look at these kind of relationships almost akin to courtship.
John Cipher is a 28-year veteran of the CIA and of spy games with Russia. He says the content of the meeting is less important than the fact that it took place at all. The meeting was billed in an email to Donald Trump Jr. as a meeting with a Russian government lawyer who had information that would incriminate Hillary.
The fact that he responded positively would have been a signal to the Russians that, hey, there's a green light here, let's take the next step. However, you can't come at that next step with the full goods for fear that in the meantime, the Trump campaign would have talked to their lawyers, their security people, and maybe even informed the FBI.
Which is why, Cipher says, they sent in a lawyer instead of a spy. It's all part of the slow dance of seduction that would be typical, he says, of developing a covert relationship.
Her role would have been all along about deniability. She merely had to show up at that meeting and report back to Russia.
Which brings us to the bigger question. How deep are Veselnitskaya's ties with the Russian state? For starters, court documents show she was doing legal work for Russia's intelligence agency, the FSB.
How did you get picked to represent the intelligence agency? You weren't representing the FSB at all?
Я не представляла интересы ФСБ. Я представляла интересы войсковой части, которая имеет очень отдаленное отношение к ФСБ.
So to be clear, you were working for a military unit that has ties to the FSB.
Я не могу более сказать вам ничего.
If you're a private lawyer or a private business person in Russia, people there understand very well what it means to deal with the state. There's corruption, there's danger, but there's also potentially large money and lucrative contacts to be had.
And Veselnitskaya has lucrative contacts. She is widely referred to as a legal fixer for Pyotr Katsev, a former official and powerful Russian businessman. When American prosecutors took legal action against a company owned by Katsev's son, she went to New York.
She was essentially a shadow counsel for one of the defendants in that case.
Jamie Nowadays was one of the prosecutors on the case.
What does a shadow counsel mean?
She's not licensed to practice here in New York, so she couldn't argue in court on behalf of her client, but she nevertheless filed declarations in court. She was clearly a driver of the legal defense team.
In 2013, the U.S. government confiscated several properties in Manhattan, which, it argued, were purchased with the loot from one of the most notorious crimes ever committed in Russia.
This case was unusual because we have this massive tax fraud, but this tax fraud is then connected to the imprisonment, torture, and murder of Sergei Magnitsky, the lawyer who is investigating the fraud and its cover-up.
Magnitsky, the lawyer who exposed the $230 million fraud, accused some of Russia's most powerful officials of being involved. They threw him in jail.
And after 358 days in prison, he died in excruciating pain on November 16, 2009.
Magnitsky became a symbol. In 2012, Congress passed the Magnitsky Act, which placed personal sanctions on the corrupt Russians he named, including some of Vladimir Putin's closest associates. Nowadays' team believed some of the dirty money was used to buy condo units in New York.
The U.S. Department of Justice puts out a request to Russia asking for bank records, incorporation records, because the underlying fraud involved the theft of corporate identities.
How did the Russian authorities respond?
Essentially, they responded by saying that the U.S. government's allegations were without merit and they would not be providing the records.
Were you surprised by that response?
Well, yes, because it's not the job of the foreign government to reinvestigate and come to its own conclusion about the merits of the government's case.
The Russian government has always angrily denied Magnitsky's allegations of fraud and corruption. But what American prosecutors didn't know in 2014 was the role Veselnitskaya may have played in crafting the official Russian response.
What I wanted to ask you about are these emails. If you could take a look at them.
The documents are said to be emails exchanged between Veselnitskaya and an official at the Russian Prosecutor General's office. In them, she appears to review and edit the Russian response to the American request for information. NBC cannot confirm the authenticity of the emails, but changes suggested in them ended up in the official document that was sent back to the U.S. Department of Justice.
So my question is, What were you discussing in these emails and with whom?
Во-первых, я не могу подтвердить, что это вообще моя переписка.
Are you saying that they were obtained illegally, or are you saying that they are false?
Я не могу сказать ни то, ни другое. Конкретно
The edits
что?
suggest you were dictating to the prosecutor's office how they should respond to the U.S. Justice Department.
Ничего
Is that the
подобного.
case?
Это неправда. По какой-то причине вся ваша пиар-машина американская обвиняет мою страну в том, что мы такие непревзойденные в киберхаках. Может, вы сами все повскрывали?
You meaning me?
Нет, не вас лично.
At this point, Veselnitskaya started listing off names of Americans, officials, journalists, and private citizens whom she suspected were behind the leak. But we got the emails from a Russian who said they were sent anonymously.
How did you get these documents?
У нас есть проект, который называется проект «Досье», почтовый ящик, на который могут люди присылать в анонимном режиме соответствующую информацию.
Mikhail Khodorkovsky was the richest man in Russia until Putin took most of his fortune and threw him in jail. When he got out, he left the country and made it his business to fight the Russian government. He's confident the emails came from Veselnitskaya's account.
Are these genuine? And if so, why do you think that?
Мы полагаем, что это документы подлинные. Мы посмотрели метаданные. Американцы должны точно понимать, что, общаясь с госпожой Весельницкой, они общаются не с обычным адвокатом, они общаются с человеком.
We also showed the emails to Maddow, the former government lawyer.
The underlining is an addition. The strikeout is obviously a deletion.
You can see on paper the dialogue that was going back and forth.
I was shocked to see them. I cannot emphasize enough how profoundly troubling and inappropriate those communications are.
Why?
Well, it suggests that the process, certainly in this case, was rigged. I mean, she was going behind the scenes and having communications with the Russian prosecutors about the nature of their response to the U.S. Department of Justice.
So she's telling the Russian government what to tell you, which helps her client.
And then, after the response comes back to the United States, she uses the language of that response to advantage her client.
So this suggests a degree of collusion that you did not anticipate.
Absolutely. I mean, there's complete behind the scenes, pulling the strings, interference.
Is it illegal or unethical or both?
It certainly raises very serious questions about obstruction of justice. It raises very serious questions about false statements to the U.S. court.
You said that you never tried to dictate the case that the Russian prosecutor was giving. If you did, and that's what these documents suggest, would that be an obstruction of justice? Would you?
Какое вмешательство? Вы о чем вообще?
If you were trying to
Вы о
dictate to
чем?
the prosecutor
Это мы
general.
заставили прокуратуру Соединенных Штатов. Вы о чем? Секунду, Ричард. Хочу сделать вам замечание под камеру.
Veselnitskaya said her accounts had been hacked, and she recognized some of the details in the printouts we handed to her.
Здесь многие вещи есть из моих обращений. Это было в одной из моих справок, которые я передавала в Генеральную прокуратуру. Но этого нет. Нет, я не могу это подтвердить.
I'm trying to find out in this case whether you were cooperating or colluding with the Russian state, which raises questions about your background, particularly in light of the fact that you were in the Trump Tower with the that's what this is all about. The only reason I'm asking these questions is because of the contact that you had with the most senior people who are now in our government.
Так, еще раз, Ричард. Мне совершенно все равно, какое у вас правительство и кто его наполняет.
You said your relationship with the prosecutor general is what?
Я являюсь адвокатом, и я являюсь информатором.
So this is not somebody who is separated from state power. She's a very savvy operator and has a level of comfort that what she's doing is in line with what the Kremlin wants done.
What the Kremlin wants is to get the sanctions lifted, which is what Veselnitskaya talked about with the Trump team. That fact, together with the suggestion that she had dirt on Hillary Clinton, should, Cipher says, have caused the Trump team to ring the alarm bells.
That's simply showing a willingness to collude. That's, if not against the law, it's unethical, immoral, and certainly unpatriotic.
Veselnitskaya still insists emphatically that she doesn't work for the Russian government or intelligence services. But she appears to have extraordinary access to the upper ranks of the Russian state. As the ex-CIA officer we spoke to said, it's all about deniability. So, it seems, is Russia's use of mercenaries in Syria. Stay with us for more on that after the break. Plus, Congressman Jim Himes on Putin's goals.
Vladimir Putin's whole thing is about deniability, projecting force, messing around in areas where when things go wrong, he can just say, these folks had nothing to do with me.
And welcome back to Tallinn, Estonia. So, we talked about how Russia uses deniable operatives to carry out sensitive missions, like political influence campaigns. But it seems it's using the same strategy on the battlefield. Earlier this year, mercenaries from a shadowy company with links to Putin even went so far as attacking U.S. forces in Syria. It was the first time Russian-led forces engaged U.S. troops in 50 years. But again, it was deniable. So we went to the war zone to follow the trail of the Russian mercenaries.
General Jonathan Braga, a veteran Special Forces commander, took us along on his chopper to see, for the very first time, the spot where it all happened, the Conoco oil refinery in eastern Syria. Several of the buildings here took direct hits, but the oil facilities stand, for the most part, undamaged.
I have combat power.
Braga walked us through what happened here on February 7th, starting with the first sign of trouble.
We saw vehicle movements, troop movements, rehearsals and the like. Again, something we hadn't seen before.
So what did you do when you saw this force gathering?
Yeah, I called my contact.
This is like a red phone to the Russians?
Yes, we deconflict with the Russians to make sure there's no miscalculations and de-escalate anything that might be happening.
The Russians assured Braga that they had no forces in the area, and yet the mysterious enemy fighters kept moving forward.
About 2 hours later, we started receiving artillery rounds, followed by tank direct fire, and then eventually small arms fire as well, as upwards of several hundred forces.
You were being deliberately targeted, and they were moving artillery in closer and closer.
Absolutely, and that led to obviously immediate, again, phone conversation with the Russians.
So you called and said, stop this?
Yes, I did.
But the fire kept coming in. Braga had enough.
We feel threatened. We have certain measures that we take, and we escalate.
And they escalated all right. Within minutes, American airstrikes were coming in, hard. They kept coming for 3 hours. These recordings, authenticated by a senior U.S. military official, are of mercenaries, Russian-speaking mercenaries, reporting heavy losses. We had our butts kicked. One squadron lost 200 people. The Yankees, they said, knew we were coming, and they knew we were Russian.
There have been reports that 200 to 300 of the Russian force was killed. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's, I would say, close to our estimates as well.
That was the first time any American official openly said that. The Pentagon and the White House had been very reluctant to talk about the incident.
I think they wanted to keep this quiet because they didn't want this to escalate into some sort of incident.
Michael Carpenter worked the Russia beat at the Pentagon during the Obama administration. The Russians, he said, were also eager to keep the incident under wraps.
The U.S. side notified the Russian side through our 24/7 deconfliction channel that we were taking incoming and that we were going to call in airstrikes. And the Russians said, copy, we understand that that's going to happen. And yet, the Russian Deconfliction Center did not notify the mercenaries on the ground that the U.S. Air Force was coming in.
After all, mercenaries are deniable and dispensable.
There's nothing necessarily wrong with using contract soldiers, unless, of course, you're lying to your own people and trying to cover up the true nature of a country's involvement in a military adventure in a third country.
Russia's adventure in Syria is no secret. It sent tens of thousands of troops there over the last 3 years. The secret is that there are about 3,000 other Russian fighters in Syria, under arms, but off the books.
These contractors are used as crack stormtroops to go in and fight the fight and take the casualties.
Pavel Felgenhauer, a military analyst, says they work for a shadowy Russian company known as the Wagner Group.
The Russian military is huge. There are hundreds of thousands of uniformed soldiers. Why use hired hands?
For secrecy and possible deniability. That's a way to control the flow of information, which makes these mercenaries, volunteers, contractors more preferable.
Lock and load!
There is, of course, a precedent for all this. Blackwater, the American company once known as the world's most powerful mercenary army.
Russia has modeled Wagner consciously on Blackwater. I mean, they saw Blackwater as the perfect solution to being able to have some plausible deniability and less responsibility for protecting the lives of soldiers in hotspots.
When real Russian soldiers die in hotspots, they receive full military honors. Wagner fighters do not. We traveled more than 1,000 miles east of Moscow to a small town where several of the mercenaries killed in Syria were being buried. Their funerals were quick, quiet family ceremonies. Our cameras were clearly not welcome. Local politician Natalia Krylova is trying to break the code of silence around the dead contractors.
If our guys must go to Syria to die, let it be official. They should be buried as heroes.
Her friend, Igor Kosoturov, who worked for Wagner, died in Syria.
We'll talk in the car.
Krylova agreed to take us to see his family. On the way, she tells us she only learned what Igor was up to after he died.
I know for a fact that he wasn't fighting for the military. So when I found out that he was killed by the American airstrike in February, I realized he must have been working for Wagner.
She believes Igor, a former soldier, only signed up because he needed the money.
He had a small store here in the village. But with the economic crisis, with the American sanctions, no one has money to buy anything.
We hope to get some answers at Igor's store.
So we're going to hang back a little bit while she goes and talks to Igor's ex-wife, see if she can convince her to come out and tell us why the families are unwilling to talk to us.
But even Krylova couldn't convince the family to speak to us. Investigating the Wagner Group can be a dangerous business around here. Local journalist Maxim Borodin, who wrote about the dead mercenaries, mysteriously fell from his 5th-floor apartment.
Is this the building?
Borodin's friend, Slava Bashkov, showed me where it happened. Shortly before the alleged accident, he said Borodin called him to say that armed men in masks turned up at his place. Hours later, he was dead. That happens occasionally to Russian journalists who ask too many questions. But try as it might, the Kremlin can't keep Wagner's work a secret. Dogged Russian journalists revealed the names and faces of dozens of fighters who died in Syria. 2 of them were captured by ISIS. Others were caught on camera, arriving at a Russian airport carrying duty-free bags from Syria. There's even a rap video celebrating Wagner's frontline victory. The man behind Wagner is believed to be the man standing next to Putin, Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Prigozhin is a funder of Wagner. He bankrolls the organization, but doesn't have extensive military experience, so he's not calling the shots on the ground.
Prigozhin used to be a hot dog salesman. Now, he's known as Putin's chef.
He has a massive catering business that makes a lot of money thanks to very lucrative contracts that he's able to score based on his relationship to Putin. And in turn, he does Putin's favors.
One of those favors earned Prigozhin an indictment from special counsel Robert Mueller for running the troll farm which attacked our elections. But favors go both ways. Prigozhin has a contract with the Syrian government that gives him 25% of the revenue from any oil field his mercenaries grab. According to a U.S. military source, Prigozhin sent a message to Damascus just before the attack, saying he had a good surprise that would come between February 6th and 9th. The oil field attack on American troops happened on the night of the 7th.
Russia right now is engaged in a war against Western democracies using hidden means. And so whether it's cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, or whether it's proxies on the ground in places like Syria and Ukraine, it's all methods that are used that hide in the shadows.
You may have noticed we didn't interview anyone from Wagner in the story. We were on to one man who claimed he was in Syria and in that battle with the Americans. Through an intermediary, we were trying to convince him to do an interview with us, until suddenly he got a call. A voice said, "You talk too much." He backed out.
Coming up, Congressman Jim Himes with some thoughts on how to push Putin back.
We need to make it very, very clear to the Kremlin that there are red lines, that if he crosses with his military or with proxies, there will be a very vigorous response, reminiscent of the response of U.S. Special Forces against the Wagner Group in Syria.
Welcome back. Tonight we've brought you our exclusive on the Russian lawyer at the Trump Tower meeting who admitted she has much stronger ties to the Russian government than she's acknowledged before. Democratic Congressman Jim Himes is on the House Intelligence Committee. We wanted his opinion on our story. We spoke in his office in Connecticut.
We shared some of our reporting on Natalia Veselnitskaya, the Russian lawyer who met with the Trump campaign team in 2016 with Congressman Jim Himes and asked him for his thoughts.
And I haven't seen the details, but this sort of paints a picture of Veselnitskaya as a broad-ranging operative and advisor to the Russian government.
And then suddenly she's at that key meeting in Trump Tower with Donald Jr., Paul Manafort, and Jared Kushner. So what does that say?
Well, again, this is success beyond the wildest dreams of the Kremlin, right? Because, you might have gotten a cup of coffee with Don Jr. at the Starbucks downstairs, but instead you're sitting in a conference room deep in Trump Tower. By the way, that raises all sorts of counterintelligence issues that we don't talk much about, but, you got all these people associated with the Russians wandering around the very heart of the Trump campaign.
Troubling?
Beyond troubling. 9 out of 10 Americans would have said, wait a second, Russians want to give me dirt on my political opponent. I'm in politics too. The first thing you do is you call the FBI and say, hey, they're dangling something for me. Instead, Don Jr. on email says, I love it, bring it on. So profoundly troubling.
Americans, Himes said, have a hard time understanding that under Putin, the lines between Russian state business and private business are blurred.
Vladimir Putin's whole thing is about deniability, projecting force, messing around in areas where when things go wrong, he can just say, these folks had nothing to do with me.
Is it a winning strategy? And is the U.S. doing enough to stop that strategy?
Well, I think Putin has achieved a lot of his aims. So I think the response has got to be to make sure the West understands that this is his critical strategy. We need to call his bluff. We need to say, look, whether it's Veselnitskaya or mercenaries operating in Syria, they're yours. You own them.
What do you know about the attack that took place in Syria?
It's a little hard to believe that the Russian commanders on the ground didn't know exactly what their mercenaries were doing. Maybe they thought that the Americans were operating with rules of engagement or with a fear of engaging Russians that would allow these commanders to push them around a little bit, right? If that was their thinking, it was a huge miscalculation, and obviously there's a lot of dead Russian mercenaries to show for that miscalculation.
Some in the administration are using it as a badge of honor to show that in certain cases they are absolutely willing to stand up to Russia.
Using that as evidence that the Americans are tough on the Russians is just absurd. What the Americans on the ground there did as artillery was landing around their ears and as they were under attack by Russian irregular forces, they defended themselves, right? United States Special Operations is not going to take incoming artillery and not respond to it.
But he says we do need to get tough on the Russians before it's too late.
I would also argue that the president's refusal to call Russia out for what it is means that Vladimir Putin thinks he's got a lot of operational room.
Why don't you think he's willing to call them out?
Well, that's the million-dollar question today. This president likes strongmen. He sees himself as a strongman. You know, he bridles at the constraints that we have on the president, the courts, the media, the Congress. He just hates it, and I think he admires those leaders who can operate abroad without constraint.
What can the U.S. do?
Make it very, very clear to the Kremlin that there are red lines that if he crosses with his military or with proxies, there will be a very vigorous response reminiscent of the response of U.S. Special Forces against the Wagner Group in Syria.
U.S. officials think Putin is being aggressive, but many Russians don't see it. Instead, they see Putin as trying to right a historic wrong, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Coming up, what shaped the Russian president's worldview? A look at the making of a new Russian czar. Tonight, we reported on Russian covert political influence campaigns and the use of mercenaries, these dispensable soldiers, invisible in life and in death. We know where Putin's tactics came from. He was a spy before becoming president. But what about the ambition? Journalist Susan Glasser, who's been writing about Putin for nearly 2 decades, tells us it started at an early age.
Vladimir Putin is a classic product of the Soviet Union. His grandfather was a cook for Lenin and later for Stalin himself.
German troops pushed the Russians back.
His parents managed, but just barely, to survive World War II. After the war in 1952, Vladimir Putin's mother gave birth to him in her early 40s. Vladimir Putin, a kind of a tough, angry kid, and he lived in a communal apartment. They didn't have basically any privacy. They had one room to themselves. He eventually took up martial arts and channeled some of that anger. He watched on TV. In particular, there was a series called The Sword and the Shield that really glorified the role of the predecessors of the KGB. And so that's the kind of spy that Vladimir Putin grew up wanting to be. And actually, it was in his German class that he finally, sort of buckled down, and that seemed to help him focus his energies. And he eventually then went on to law school and, tried to figure out what would it take to get me into the KGB. He ended up as a lieutenant colonel. He was not perceived to win the best, most elite assignments. Vladimir Putin did not go to London. He was posted in Dresden, a relative backwater. He was not an undercover spy doing James Bond-like missions over the Berlin Wall.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
In November of 1989, remember, is when the wall opened in Berlin. People were taking to the streets. Vladimir Putin thought they were coming for him. That must have been a terrifying moment when he thought they were coming into the KGB's office. They're frantically burning papers. They cabled back to Moscow, and Moscow was silent. He himself goes outside and confronts the angry crowd. He has nothing really to tell them. He's bluffing, and he convinces them not to storm the building and to go away. Vladimir Putin returns to Russia in tumult, to the Soviet Union collapsing, ends up working for a very charismatic first post-Soviet mayor of St. Petersburg. So Vladimir Putin, went in just a couple years' time from a nobody in St. Petersburg to having a series of the most important jobs in Russia. For someone like a former lieutenant colonel to rise to be the president of Russia was a shocking event in Russian post-Soviet society. He was pretty ruthless in following the KGB playbook throughout his very unlikely rise in politics, and also, obviously, since he's been the president of Russia. Had you told me, or I think most people, Russians or Americans, in the spring of 2000, 2001, that Vladimir Putin would end up being the longest-serving Russian leader since Joseph Stalin, whom his grandfather worked for as a cook, you know, I think we would not have believed you.
Putin has proven to be a survivor. But how? Coming up, we meet some Russians who are trying to take him on.
I have no idea how many time we spent for this. Maybe 1 year, maybe 10 years, maybe all our lives. But we should do this. We should keep fighting just because it's correct.
Welcome back. People sometimes ask me, is Putin really popular? The simple answer is he does have a lot of support, but he has opponents too. They get crushed whenever they face Putin head on. So now some are trying a new strategy.
It's difficult and dangerous to stand up to a man as determined, and some say ruthless, as Vladimir Putin. But this January, a few thousand Russians took to the streets to call for a boycott of the presidential elections. 18-year-old student Katya was in the crowd that day, well aware of the danger.
Do you think you're going to get arrested?
I'm ready for that, yes.
Impeachment!
But Katya and her fellow protesters were determined to deliver their anti-Putin message and to take it as close to his front door as possible.
That's the Kremlin right there, and the protesters are still marching toward it. Generally, this is considered a no-go area for demonstration.
Rallies were held all over Russia, and hundreds were arrested, including opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who was barred from running in the elections. Putin is proud of his approval ratings, and he owes them in part to his real popularity, but also to the silencing of his opponents. I met Navalny's chief of staff, Leonid Volkov.
Is there freedom to operate and be part of a democracy in Russia now?
Okay, at least we sit here in this office, we are free to talk, right? It's something.
You say we're free to talk in this office, but the police have come into this office and arrested people, no?
A couple of times, yes.
But being sent to jail isn't the worst thing that can happen to people who oppose Putin. No one is safe. And that message was delivered loud and clear in 2015, when one of the most prominent, best-known opposition leaders, Boris Nemtsov, was gunned down in the shadow of the Kremlin. 5 men from Chechnya were found guilty of his murder, but Nemtsov's friends and family believe the trial was a cover-up.
Many people for a long time was trying to have memorial of Boris Nemtsov for 3 years.
I met Ilya Yashin outside Nemtsov's old apartment in Moscow.
Half of my life, it's life under Putin. And I see that we have no future with Putin in my country.
For many years, Yashin used radical forms of protest to fight back.
We have no public policy, we have no public competition, we have no open and free parliaments.
Last year, he took his protest off the street and into the district council in Moscow, where he now serves as a deputy.
Do you think you're making a difference?
Yes, I think so. I can help people, I can show how the authority can work without Putin.
Yashin isn't the only opposition activist to go into local politics.
We ran 1,017 candidates and won 267 seats. This was a tremendous success.
Political consultant Vitaly Skliarov believes all politics are local.
That's where first-time candidates or people with no political experience whatsoever do the first step, and that's where they learn. This small work is really important. That's where real political activism starts.
Skliarov splits his time between Moscow and Washington, D.C., where he moved 8 years ago. He worked on American political campaigns for Obama and Bernie Sanders. That's where he got the idea for what he calls political Uber.
Politics should be as easy as Uber ride. You don't have to have party or a lot of money. We ran the most successful and the most affordable campaign ever. Each candidate costs us a day, like a cup of coffee, $2.5.
Yashin is getting the hang of local politics and is ready, he says, to take the next step. He plans to run for mayor of Moscow in September.
If I became mayor, we have much more opportunity to change not only Moscow, but Russia.
Skliarov says it's going to take time.
I believe if I invest 25 years of my life in this project, in the development of politics in Russia. I believe one day this country gonna start to change.
Yashin knows that running for a high-profile job could put him in the Kremlin's crosshairs.
We understand that every one of us can be in jail, can be killed, but if you are not ready to keep fighting, you should stop.
He feels he owes it to those who came before him.
So you're ready to die for this?
I do what I believe in, and I will not stop. Because of Nemtsov, because all my friends was in prison, I cannot stop. I have no idea how many time we spent for this. Maybe 1 year, maybe 10 years, maybe all our lives. But we should do this. We should keep fighting just because it's correct.
Coming up, we explore this country, Estonia, a former Soviet nation that's now trying to make a clean break with its past. And welcome back to Estonia. This is a tiny country, just 1.3 million people. It's a member of NATO, but it sits right on Russia's border. So every time Putin makes a move, people here take notice. The host of a popular foreign affairs show, Tarmo Myberg, took me to a place that sums up how this country is trying to move on from its past.
So what is this place?
Well, as you can see, there are statues from Soviet heroes. Let's say Stalin, also we have Lenin over there. And all those statues are a remembrance of back in time when we didn't have that much of freedom or liberties.
How far away are we from Russia right now, the Russian border?
About 300 kilometers.
What is it like to live on the doorstep of Russia?
You can't think about it every day, because otherwise you would end up mad, I think, because if you read only the news that Russia is attacking one neighbor or another, Georgia, Ukraine, and now it is in Syria, you start to think that, of course. But
you start to what? Worry that you're next?
Yes, of course, we're worried. We have to always be aware that there might do something, but what it is exactly, we don't know.
When you see what's going on in the United States and what has been going on, propaganda campaigns over social media, hacks from Russia, does this sort of sound familiar to you?
Of course. We have that kind of propaganda all the time in our Russian media. They are saying that this is the country that is not very big. This is the country that should be in part of bigger Russia, let's say.
What, they say greater Russia?
Greater Russia, probably, yes.
How do you think the world should deal with Russia?
$1 million question right now. So I understand the way that we have to communicate with Russia and with Putin, but we need sanctions. Otherwise, they will just do whatever they like.
One more thing before we go tonight. The Russia investigation is getting more intense and detailed by the day, and that makes it more serious, but also harder to follow. And the more confusing it gets, the easier it is to dismiss the whole thing as smoke and mirrors. We don't know what Robert Mueller has, but we know he's looking at that Trump Tower meeting, and he's looking at the head of the mercenary outfit, who's also accused of election meddling. So while it may be hard to see sometimes, a full picture is emerging, like a mosaic being crafted one piece at a time. Thanks for watching tonight. Follow us on Twitter at OA Richard Engel. We'll be back soon.
The Rachel Maddow Show, weeknights at 9 Eastern on MSNBC. Thanks for listening to the Rachel Maddow Show podcast. You can listen to MSNBC 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on TuneIn.